AZZA is a PC case manufacturer that's known for thinking outside the box when it comes to case design, bringing us pyramid cases, cube cases, octagon cases, convertible cases, and this dual overhead cam engine inspired enclosure. So when they asked if I wanted to check out their newest case, I was like, yeah, let's see what crazy you came up with this time. But to my disappointment, I found that their new Legionnaire case was just a standard rectangular mid-tower PC case. AZZA went back to thinking inside the box on this one, with one exception. Instead of the see-through tempered glass side panel that's become the standard on gaming cases, AZZA has created a breathe-through side panel. Has AZZA seen the writing on the wall and got out ahead of the expected power demand and heat load of the next generation of PC components? Will this provide the air cooling needed for new power-hungry GPU and CPUs? Or will it just let all the dust in and noise out? Let's find out. Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, and this is the AZZA Legionaire, one of two new gaming cases released by AZZA, the second being the Arrow, which is identical to the Legionnaire, just with a different front panel design, both with an MSRP of $110 US. I've spent a few days with the case now, pulled it apart, built a PC in it, and now it's time to discuss. But before I get into my experience with and thoughts on the case, I'll take you through the specs and features, show you what you can and can't fit in the case. I'll take you through my build notes, talk about the overall quality of the case, the pros and cons. We'll look at some temperatures and see if the perforated side panel is helpful, and we'll finish up with my overall conclusion on the value of the Legionnaire. Is it really worth north of $100? The Legionnaire is a mid-tower case and measures 440 millimeters deep by 220 millimeters wide by 483 millimeters tall. The case is compatible with mini ITX, micro ATX, and ATX motherboards, and it has a forward set of cable pass-throughs and standoff mounting locations to install eATX boards up to 330 millimeters wide. The Legionnaire can accommodate CPU tower coolers up to 170 millimeters, graphics card up to 400 millimeters, and ATX power supplies up to 180 millimeters. The case comes with four 120 millimeter fans, three front intake, and a rear exhaust, but can accommodate three 140 millimeter fans in the front, three top mounted 120 or two 140 millimeter fans. An additional two 120 mil fans can be added to the top of the power supply shroud. Radiator or AIO support includes up to a 360 millimeter rad in the front and or up to a 280 millimeter rad up top. In the bottom of the case, there's a removable drive cage that can hold two 3.5 inch hard drives or two 2.5 inch SSDs, and there are an additional two SSD mounts behind the motherboard tray. There's about 20 millimeters of space for cable management and tie-down points along the front of the case and around the motherboard cutout. The front I/O includes the power button and a reset switch that has been repurposed as the LED selector, two 5 gigabit USB Type-A ports, and individual 3.5 millimeter headphone and microphone jacks. The rear of the case includes 7 bridged PCIe expansion ports with break-off style covers. The plastic front panel has an angled vent design with mesh filters between each vent. Additionally, there's a magnetic top filter and a small bottom filter for the PSU intake. Finally, the left side panel is constructed from 1.75 millimeter perforated steel mesh. For testing, I installed my standard ATX test system, a Gigabyte RX 6700 XT and Ryzen 7 3700X, cooled with a Deepcool AK400 tower cooler, and the build went pretty smoothly. Everything fit, there was plenty of pass-throughs and space for cables on the top and front of the motherboard. However, although there are large pass-throughs on the bottom of the case, most of that space is blocked by the power supply. Therefore, it's necessary to route the cables before installing the PSU, and because the USB 3 connector is on the bottom of my motherboard, the cable was too thick and was pinched by the PSU, so I had to use one of my USB 3 ribbon cable extensions. I did use an air cooler for this build, however, if using a top-mounted AIO, there is about 45 millimeters of clearance, so therefore no problem for taller RAM. With no real cable management extras, I just used a few tie-down points and some zip ties to clean up the cables behind the motherboard tray and stuff the excess in the basement as God intended. Now, I can go through some other minor build notes, but the big takeaway is the overall build experience was good for a $60 case. Unfortunately, this case cost almost twice that. I'll get into all the areas that subtract from the value of the case, but I'll start with the pros. First, the case comes with 4 fans, and they're even RGB fans. The case does have a second set of pass-throughs and standoff locations for eATX boards, so unlike most mid-tower cases that say they support eATX but the board just covers the cable pass-throughs, this case does actually support boards up to 330 millimeters wide. And that's it for the features that separate the Legionnaire from a typical $60 enclosure. As far as the features that it shares with cheaper cases, let's start again with the fans. These aren't AZZA's premium Hurricane or Prisma fans, just some random RGB case fans which have one of the weirdest wiring schemes I've ever seen. The front fans have a single 5-pin daisy chainable JST connector that combines the fan and RGB connection, but the rear fan is completely different. It's like the control fan and has a JST wire plus a 2-pin wire that connects to the reset switch, a 4-pin PWM fan connector and 3-pin RGB connector to connect the fans to the motherboard. Then there's a 3-pin JST connector that connects to a SATA wiring harness that's only needed to power the front panel RGB logo. The RGB lighting is actually powered by the fan header, and essentially all the control hardware is in the rear fan, and the LED switch on the case is just a reset switch. There's no RGB control hardware in the case itself. So if the rear fan dies, they all die, and it just so happens that there's a short of some sort in the rear fan that came with my case, which causes the RGB to flicker. That white flashing is a bug, not a feature. I tried connecting the fans every way possible, and it's definitely caused by the rear fan. Even when I switch to motherboard control, it still happens. Also, once you restart the PC, or even when it wakes from sleep, the fans revert back to their default light pattern. So bad fans, first con. Then there's just the overall build quality and materials. The case is constructed from very thin, cheap, flimsy steel. None of the panels fit together well, and there are large gaps. All the cable pass-throughs were a pro, but not a single rubber grommet on any of them. Definitely something you expect at this price point, as well as some cable management features. There are no cable routing channels, clips, or Velcro cable ties. Another thing you expect at this price point is a PSU bracket so you can install the power supply from the rear. I actually forgot to connect the SATA power cable before installing the PSU and trying to find the right connection while fishing it through the other cables and past the drive cage. Not easy. Also, break off PCIe covers. I didn't even discover that until after I got the PC assembled and went to install the graphics card, so I had to break off the 2 covers, being careful not to damage the motherboard. The other very disappointing result is then you have bridged PCIe slots, so you can't use the vertical GPU mount like this Universal Fantex one I have. A mesh side panel begs for a vertically mounted GPU, but not possible in this case. I could cut the bridges out, but the steel is so flimsy that there wouldn't be enough structural integrity to install the vertical mount. The case is also just a few millimeters shy of being able to fit a 360mm top-mounted radiator. I mean, it's so close it almost seems like a mistake. Now, there are fan mount locations on the top of the PSU shroud, and AZZA even provides long screws to mount the fans, but they're directly above the power supply, which blocks most of the possible airflow. And finally, the front I/O doesn't offer a USB-C high-speed port. But getting back to airflow, does this perforated side panel offer any additional airflow or cooling to the system? Well, to start, because the stock setup, 3 intake fans, 1 exhaust, is a positive pressure setup, there shouldn't be too much dust pulled in through the side of the case, while a lot of the excess heat from the components will be able to escape without building up inside the case. Overall temps compared to the system on an open air test bench were okay, with the CPU and GPU temps each up 2 degrees, and the motherboard VRM temps were 5 degrees higher. Of course, with an open side and cheap fans, the sound level at full load was 9.3 decibels louder compared to the open test bench. To see how much the open side contributed to cooling, I sealed off the panel, and the CPU temp was 3 degrees higher, GPU was 1 degree higher, when the motherboard stayed the same as compared to the mesh panel. So the perforated side panel does provide more cooling, and with the next generation of what's expected to be power-hungry components, this might be a great alternative to today's standard tempered glass. So by modernizing this older case design feature, AZZA may have gotten out ahead of the competition. Unfortunately, there are just too many other cost-saving features in the Legionnaire case design to warrant the $110 price tag. So final conclusion, this is a great case with good cooling potential, it's just significantly overpriced. But if you like mesh panel concepts, check out my review of the ASUS AP201, a micro ATX tower wrapped in mesh on 4 sides. If you have any questions about this case, something I may not have addressed, please ask in the comments below, and be sure to click that like and maybe subscribe, and I hope to catch you in the next one.